Good evening. Welcome to Q&A. Tonight we're broadcasting from the Melbourne Writers' Festival with leading political journalist and author of Triumph and Demise, Paul Kelly, the chair of the Australian Muslim Women's Centre for Human Rights, Tasneem Chopra, health activist Elizabeth Pisani, whose latest book, Indonesia, etc., tracks her travels through the country she describes as her bad boyfriend. Former Foreign Minister Gareth Evans, who's just published his cabinet diaries inside the Hawke-Keating government, and Iranian-Australian novelist and commentator Alizadeh. Please welcome our panel. Thank you. Q&A is simulcast on ABC News 24 News Radio, and you can join the Twitter conversation by using the Quanda hashtag on your screen. And please add @Quanda if you've got a live question for us. Well, we asked Q&A Facebook followers what they'd like us to talk about tonight. They've nominated keeping politics sane, homegrown terror, and how to get political reform before the crisis hits. We'll start tonight with a question from Siobhan Lynch-Wells.
As a member of today's youth, it concerns me that Australians are leaving Australia to support Islamic extremists in Syria and Iraq and then returning here. After Khalid Sharoof from Sydney photographed his 7-year-old son holding a severed head, does the panel have any suggestions on how we can ensure this extremist Islam doesn't develop in Australia?
Tasneem, let's start with you.
A nice easy one, thank you. Look, I think my first reaction to this would be to explain my response to the severing of the head, and naturally, like I think pretty much everyone that I know, it was shock, it was horror, I was appalled. Appalled as a human being, appalled as a mother, and yes, appalled as a Muslim, especially as a Muslim, in fact. But I'm also keeping in check the horror that I feel when I see a TV image of a child lying in a bed whose brain is missing and half a head is gone after an explosion in Palestine. When I see an African-American young adolescent who's been shot and killed unarmed in Ferguson. Or when I see or hear of a refugee that's drowned at sea. So I think for me it's about acknowledging not just the spectacle of each of these tragedies, but also equally why they're happening. What is causing these events to happen? It's a systemic issue. And to the issue of my concern about homegrown terror, yes, I mean, I think every Australian has that apprehension, has that concern. I think the Muslim community have long explained their position on this and have explained their condemnation of terror, ad nauseum, in fact, not just within Australia, within the UK, the US, Canada and abroad. The Organisation of Islamic Committees, which is 57 countries, have actually put out a statement only recently condemning everything that ISIS represents, saying that they are, in fact, the antithesis of what Islam is. So that's not even up for discussion. It shouldn't be, but it's not what we're hearing. So while we're busy with the condemnation, we need to actually now shift towards doing something about it. And I think, we're all here to do that.
Paul Kelly.
Well, this sort of war we're seeing is a war waged through social media. And the purpose of these images is to divide our societies and divide our country, to turn Muslim against Muslim, to turn non-Muslims against Muslims. That is the purpose of this exercise. So we've got to respond at different levels. We have to respond in terms of assessing the military situation, assessing the humanitarian situation, but we need to respond at home. We need to respond from the essence of what a multicultural society is really about. This is a challenge to us as a multicultural society. We need to think this through very, very carefully. And I think the essence of our response is essentially based on two ideas. It would be a mistake and a betrayal of the Australian community to play down the threat. I mean, the threat is real, it's there, we have to admit it, we have to acknowledge it, we have to discuss it. But the second principle is we've got to understand that the Islamic community in this country is part of the solution. It's fundamental to the solution. So therefore, we have to have a constructive dialogue, we have to have a constructive relationship and prove that we can get through the challenge which this constitutes not just to countries like Iraq and Syria, but to countries like Australia.
Paul, very briefly, the question referred to Khalid Sharif, the man whose child was holding the severed head in that photograph. And what we know about him is that he was diagnosed after quite some years in jail, 4 years in jail, diagnosed with acute schizophrenia, with paranoia and hallucinations. I mean, should he be symbolic of anything apart from someone with severe problems?
Well, he is an individual with severe problems, but I would imagine that a lot of the Australians who've gone to participate in this conflict have also got severe problems. I mean, what the government is doing is it is responding based on the advice of the intelligence and security services. Now, that advice essentially is we've got about 150 Australians involved either in Iraq and Syria or supporting the Islamic State there. So that is a challenge to us in terms of national security, and it's got to be responded to at that level of national security.
Okay, we've got other questions on this, and before I bring in the rest of the panel, we'll bring in our second question on this subject from Fawaz Atim.
As an Australian Muslim who loves this country, why does the media and the government tell other Australians that I shouldn't be trusted? Yes, crimes against humanity are committed in the Middle East and elsewhere. Yes, Muslim fighters are killing people from ethnic backgrounds, also Muslims as well. But why should I be blamed for their actions?
Ali Alizadeh.
Look, though that's very unfair that you feel that way, and I think that's unfair. But look, I just want to say I'm glad to be here in the far left of the table, because that's where I really belong. And to stick to the spirit, I want to say, return to the first question, and it was very eloquently expressed, but I think that was a bad question. And perhaps it links to the second question as well. Why is terror and terrorism only a problem if it threatens us? We have a categorical, axiomatic problem with pedophilia, with rape, etc. There are problems as such. But suddenly this is an issue if an Australian person does it who could then come back here and behead us. It should be a problem on its own. And it really worries me, you know, when I listen to the news, that the Ukrainian crisis, which is a brutal conflict, which has cost about 3,000 lives, only becomes an issue when Australians are caught in the crossfire. And I have to say, I am moved by the humanity of the relatives of 2 of the victims of that flight that was shot down over Ukraine, who recently said that they hope their suffering makes people aware of the suffering of the people of Ukraine. I think at this point, for us to worry about what could happen to us, if they could come here and cut our heads off and put that on Twitter, we should probably feel sorry about the people of the Middle East, especially of Syria, who've been caught in this horrific sectarian war for a number of years now. About 200,000 of them are dead already. I'm sorry, to me that's a bigger issue than our fear and, frankly, our sensitivities around being stereotyped. There is a bigger problem, and that's a carnage in Syria. Both sides, north and south of the Red Sea, that's the hotspot of the next global conflict, perhaps. That worries me more than how we might feel here.
Okay, Gareth Evans, we'll get to some of those bigger subjects during the course of this discussion, but if you could address the question from the second question at least, or the first if you choose.
Well, notwithstanding Ali, I don't think we're just worried about getting our own heads cut off. I think there is a genuine humanitarian response to what we've all seen as a total humanitarian catastrophe in the Middle East, with a number of different dimensions, but most recently, of course, the IS one in Syria and Iraq. And there is an international principle of the responsibility to protect, which is deliberately designed to deal with situations of genocide, mass atrocity crimes. That's been utilised by President Obama and others recently in the context of the Yazidi minority. It may need to be utilised again, and I think we all ought to be prepared to support an international tough reaction of that kind. But the overall issue is one that's got 3 different dimensions, as I think has emerged very clearly from the discussion so far. It does have that source, that international dimension, trying somehow to solve the problem at source in the Middle East. But it's also got a law and order dimension, which we can't run away from, and we have to be prepared to take some pretty tough measures. Whether they should involve reversal of onus of proof and a tearing up of a number of our familiar libertarian guarantees in this cause is a real question for debate. But I, for one, am not too troubled by the intelligence gathering at a meta level that is part and parcel of any serious response to potentially organised terrorism and the kind of problem we are seriously confronting. But the third level, which I think has also come out well in the discussion and in that last question, is the community level of response. It's absolutely critical that mainstream Australians don't demonise Muslim Australians. Absolutely critical that we retain the confidence, the trust of our friends and colleagues in the Islamic Muslim communities in Australia, not least for the reason that we utterly depend on the cooperation and the support of those communities to give us the information that we need to ensure that these kinds of crazy individuals doing crazy things aren't able to get immunity from effective scrutiny. We do need the cooperation and support from the community. But it's a matter of our common humanity as much as anything else. And I just weep and wince when I hear questions like that people, total decency in our community being singled out for abuse and criticism and hostility simply because of their ethnicity, nationality or religion. It's terrible.
It's not just a matter of demonising Australian Muslims, it's a matter of demonising a whole class of people, a religion that is practiced very widely by very large numbers of people all around the world. And it's stupid for two reasons. One, it's just inconvenient for people like me, for example. I'm in the UK, and my Indonesian friends just can't be bothered to come and visit me anymore because if it's an Indonesian guy under 30 years old, you know, the hoops that he has to jump through to get a visa because he's from even an Indonesian Christian, but he's from a Muslim country, you know, can't get a visa. We've demonized a whole very, very large section of humanity in these practices. But it's also stupid because by demonizing people, you're fertilizing the very anger and the very upset and the very feeling of marginalization that makes people join up in places like Syria.
Tasneem, do you want to respond to that second question?
Yes, I do, actually. Now, Faz, I do take your point particularly about why, as a Muslim, do you become the face, then, of all that is negative and all that is Islamophobic? And it's a real issue that we're having to contend with. And I would go back to the reasons people are having these hostile views, to a large extent, are brought about by perhaps a failure of leadership in many regards, also through the way that Muslims are portrayed in the media. And we know the language that we deploy when we define the Muslim and when we define anything to do with Islam is loaded in very, very negative rhetoric. Just pick up any paper today and you would have probably on the front page read Islamist, jihadist, one of these, Islamist, jihadist, fundamentalist, militant, anything of an ist or an ism that is pertaining to the negative. And again, it's pertaining to Islam. So you couple all this constant negative barrage of information from both the media and from our leadership. People who don't have another source except the media to get their information are bound to then believe and just view Islam and Muslims through a negative prism. And that's constantly what you're coming to have to deal with when you go to work, when you go to school, when you leave the house. You're constantly on defence, and it's exhausting. And so when incidences like this have happened, of this culture of incidents, so there's the, why aren't the Muslims complaining, why aren't the Muslims condemning this issue? We know that they have been, but we're not being heard. Where is the leadership on the issue? It's out there. What is being done about it? We're trying to engage. But engage meaningfully with the community. Don't condescend to them. Don't expect them to rubber stamp a particular law or a particular policy that you've not actually consulted with them in a meaningful way to do it. Because then we're having this legislation and conversation about a community, but keeping the community outside of the conversation.
Okay, we've got a question that is about an attempt at consultation that's gone awry. The question is from Almir Cholan.
Thank you. Islamic Council of Victoria has withdrawn its attendance from meeting with PM Tony Abbott, partly due to the PM's careless use of divisive language. Team Australia sounds more like a Team Abbott, and it's clearly at odds with the stated objective to consult with the Muslim community. My question is, how should we engage in a dialogue when the language used is so provocative, but when we discuss, and those who don't engage are labeled as petty and foolish? Does the PM language create a divide and encourage bigotry in the community?
We should note that Almir is a member of the Islamic Council of Victoria. Paul Kelly, would you like to start?
Well, I'm not convinced that the phrase Team Australia is an automatically divisive concept. The Australian people understand the idea of team. That's understood very well. The Prime Minister, when he was talking about this, explicitly said that migrants come to this country They choose to come to this country. They choose to belong to our team. That's what he said, and he made it absolutely clear again, very explicitly, that in no way would his government ever cast doubt on the loyalty of any migrant group. So I think we need to be very careful about this phrase "Team Australia"
Who's not in the
and
team,
how it's
Paul?
interpreted.
Who's not in the team? If there's a team,
well,
must
I
be
don't-
people who are not members.
Well, I mean, I guess you'd have to ask the Prime Minister that.
Just on that issue, I mean, the Muslim community is presumably in this context being referred to as the migrant. Now, the Muslim community has been here. We know its origins predate that of Cook. We know that 50% of the Muslims in this country were born here. Over a third are under the age of 25. They're a young, educated, integrated community. So to be referred to as migrant constantly puts them on the back foot.
Well, that was a generic. I think that was a generic term being used by the Prime Minister. But I might go to the question, because I think it's a very important question. And I think the heart of this goes to what I said earlier. How do we operate as a multicultural society? Now, I'm very concerned about the boycott, and I'm very concerned about the statement released and the explanation given. If we are a multicultural society at a time like this, we've got to sit down and talk to one another. We've got to talk to one another. And I think the statement issued was a very unwise statement. It was not a prudent statement. It was an inflammatory statement. So I think that if we talk about multicultural Australia, what that means is that the majority of the population has got to respect the cultures of migrant groups, of ethnic groups. There's got to be respect for racial diversity, for religious diversity. But by the same token, ethnic groups and religious groups, whether they're Muslim, whether they're Christian, whether they're Catholic, they've also got to look at their obligations to the wider community. It cuts both ways.
Paul, I'm just going to interrupt you there because a questioner put his hand up to come back in, and we'll let you respond when he does. Here he is.
I think my question was fundamentally about the discrimination that we see in the language. When you have a peak professional body being called foolish by Prime Minister, when they, after 40 years of active engagement with the community and the government refuses to rubber stamp specific laws, my question was that kind of a language, should we tolerate as a society, that sort of divisive tone? Is that something we accept, to call Muslim leaders who represent all Muslims here as a foolish? I mean, is that society which should encourage that? Is that the leadership that we should see? That was the question.
Okay, I'll go to the other side of the panel and I'll come back to you, Paul. But Gareth Evans first.
I don't think the language "Team Australia" is provocative so much as banal. I mean, this is this. I mean, as you move from opposition to government, you're supposed to get more sophisticated, not less. But he's now moved from 3-word slogans to 2-word slogans. And the point is exactly the point that Paul Kelly made. What we're talking about here is the absolute need for a visible commitment to an inclusive Australia, a totally inclusive Australia, which is not drawing these sort of distinctions. We haven't heard enough of that kind of language from Captain Abbott, I'm afraid. We need to hear a lot more.
I would say that if Team Australia plays anti-terror as badly as Team Australia is playing rugby, witness the Bledisloe Cup this weekend, I can see why people wouldn't want to be on side.
It's extremely cruel.
Look, Ali, I was just going to say, look, firstly, I think, I don't want to mention the B word, but I think the government is having issues with something that begins with B, ends with T, baguette, something like that. I don't want to mention it because we'll end up talking about it. So I wonder if they're trying to divert attention from that B thing by dividing and conquering the community. But the second point is, I mean, it's interesting, patriotism versus religion. And here I am in my sort of Marxist atheist corner. I'm just seeing the, last refuge of the scoundrel versus the opium of the masses. And I just think that's a really poor choice, really. If people are expected to side with nationalism or religiosity, surely there should be more other options for subjectivity and being and activity and participation than you either want to behead people and post that on Twitter, or wave the national flag. I mean, that's really impoverished.
What about the obvious part of the question, though? You haven't addressed this, and it's whether or not there should be a dialogue between the Prime Minister and these Islamic groups.
Well, there probably should be, but, you know, it has to be...
Well, they've rejected it. That's
Can I say, I think the Islamic groups have
sorry.
made a mistake in rejecting that opportunity for dialogue. I understand perfectly the frustrations. I understand perfectly the response to some of the language that's used. But it's a bit like diplomatic negotiations. You don't negotiate with those with whom you begin by agreeing. You negotiate with those who are perhaps your enemy, perhaps don't agree with what you're saying. You try to persuade them. And to abandon the task of persuasion when you have the opportunity to do so is, I think, a missed opportunity. And I hope you do rethink that position.
Tasneem.
No, I was just going to say on two things. I guess on the first issue of should the community be consulted, of course the community should be consulted, and my understanding is they wanted to be consulted, but there's a process involved with that. So from what I understand, there was very short notice given. There was no agenda that was set for these meetings. There was no awareness of who was coming to the meetings. Surely this isn't how a team operates.
Couldn't you set your own agenda, though, effectively? Couldn't you say, well, this is what we want to say to you,
Well,
Prime
yes,
Minister?
this is what a consultation ideally would be all about. And just on the issue of terminology, I mean, I'd take a leaf out of the Gosford Uniting Church or the Anglican Church that put up a billing recently of Team Humanity, because that transcends all issues of faith, creed, culture, and everything.
Yeah. So, just to sort of complete the thought, do you think that the Council should reconsider?
I think with
I mean, given a process in place and given an agenda, should they reconsider?
Absolutely. Look, the councils, from my understanding and dialogue, would be open to a process of consultation before the fact and not after the fact. So let's not talk about, you know, policies and legislation that have been established and look for a rubber stamp. If you're looking for meaningful dialogue, make the community part of the process for legislation that impacts them.
I'll just go back to our question because he put his hand up again. I'll just very briefly.
I think we are avoiding the question that was asked, and the community is being forced with the Team Australia to into the 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when George Bush used similar rhetoric, you are with us or with them. And they feel like either you are on Team Australia or you are with the Team ISIS. And that's a kind of a divisive language that we see filtered down in the media. Because media picks up these statements and then mix the things, label Islamic Council as radicals, and that goes and feeds into this bigotry and hate. So the question was more about the language that we see said from leadership. How does that affect the rest of the society? I don't see it being addressed. And the engagement, of course, continues. Even as we speak, we engage with the government, with all of these body and the people. So we are continuing. It was not a question of strategically not engaging anymore with the government, but setting the right terms on which we should engage and renegotiating that. Because this is a community that will not accept to be treated the way it was treated 10, 20 years ago. We want what is normally expected from any other Australian, any other community here.
Okay, we'll take that as a comment. Go to our next question. It's from Li Shi Su.
Good evening, panel. So, is multiculturalism the real deal, or is it just a tinderbox waiting to be lit aflame by the next spark, as evidenced in conflicts everywhere?
Ali, start with you.
Well, look, I actually agree with Paul. I'm critical of multiculturalism, but from very different political perspective, because I think, look, I'm not sure if I believe in culture. I think culture is a bad, fake fantasy invented to prevent us from engaging with political, social realities. Culturism, you see, there's a problem right there. When we're being told to focus on cultural differences, cultural identity, and so on and so forth, because it is so fake, it is so provisional, it is so disconnected, I would say, from material realities and our political needs.
It's not disconnected from a lot of people, though, as you've probably picked up from some of the discussion tonight. A lot of people do identify with their cultural background.
But that's the problem, though, isn't it? I mean, I would say that if that's the sort of policy that's being propagated, you know, for probably very good intentions, I wonder what the outcomes of it would be in the long run. If they could create sectarianism and so on, but if they could disconnect us, if they could divide, if they could extract us from our material reality and conflicts that we should all be participating in together. So, So I'm not sure if what you mean, that sort of metaphor of an explosion, if you think there's going to be a sectarian conflict between different groups within Australia or not. I don't think that's going to happen because we're not a militarized society. But yeah, I'm not quite sure. I have my issues with multiculturalism myself.
Well, I've seen multiculturalism at work, and it works. I mean, my last gig in politics was to represent the seat of Holt, which is the most diverse, ethnically, multiculturally, electorate in the country. People born in 148 different countries, vast majority of them overseas or from overseas-born parents. And it was remarkably harmonious. You went to the schools, you went to the markets, and I mean, and there was an awful lot of imported sectarian potential tension there between Tamils and other Sri Lankans, between various brands of former Yugoslavians and so on. But the total environment was one of such intense, joyous interaction that I just came away loving everything about that most multicultural suburb in the whole of Australia, down in Dandenong. And I really, really, really think that this is perfectly sustainable in the Australia of the future, and this is the future for Australia. And I'm not at all pessimistic in the way the questioner was about tinderboxes and so on. We can handle it.
Tasneem, you grew up in Bendigo. Quite sort of multicultural place, and in fact, I think when you grew up, Muslims were considered to be interesting and exotic.
They were.
But now they're trying to stop a mosque being built there.
They were trying to stop the mosque. There was a petition that was put together by a few, I forgot the number of them. Maybe it was a few thousand, I'm not really sure. But I did do some research, or some research was presented to me, like in the months prior, that indicated that less than 0.05% of the signatories on that petition were actually from Bendigo. The rest were outsourced. So it was like, for want of a better phrase, rental racist, that enabled this petition to come into being. Subsequently, I mean, the local council in Bendigo overturned the petition, and I believe that the mosque is planning to go ahead. And I spoke to someone from the mosque committee today, and they told me people who are very closely aligned with the movement to stop the mosque have since changed their minds, have turned around, and have realised the valuable contribution that Muslim Australians are making to their communities and societies. There are still some people who oppose it, and it is going to VCAT, and I think in subsequent months. But it's almost a fait accompli. But it should go ahead. So, yeah, the experiences for me in Bendigo growing up were very, very different to what it is now, clearly. But my understanding is that, as a whole, the multicultural issue is, particularly in Victoria, is a success story, and we do it really well. I don't think twice about being from an African birthright of Indian heritage growing up in country Victoria. It's who I am. It's what I bring to the table. And I think so many of us in this country now have either one or two parents who hail from a different country. In fact, let's face it, aside from the First Peoples, we are all migrants. We've heard that line before. We tow it around, but it's the truth. It's a reality. So multiculturalism, like it or not, it's here and it works.
Elizabeth, the questioner asked, is multiculturalism a tinderbox, as referencing a number of conflicts with interethnic violence around the world? I mean, perhaps you could reflect on this from an Indonesian perspective, since you've written a book about it and travelled widely in this improbable country, as you call it.
Indonesia is a nation of sorts that embraces 300 and some ethnic groups, some of them very different culturally, and yet it muddles along quite well. Conflicts do arise, and when conflicts arise, it's almost always over resources, and it's almost always because one group is seen to be moving in on resources that are available to, that have been dominated by another group.
Well, like, for example, the Chinese are considered to own, by many Indonesians, too much property, have too much control of industry.
That's true. They're also considered by many Indonesians to work far too hard. So I think that when you look at most of the conflicts are actually much more local than that. So the Chinese are the equivalent of the most visibly external ethnic group, even though many of them have been there for, four centuries or more. But within the indigenous Indonesian communities, of which there are more than 300, you get a lot of conflicts, which are very often presented as, oh, it's Muslim versus Christian, oh, it's Dayak versus Chinese, but in fact, it's always almost about the fact that there's been a change of local government, and now the jobs that used to go to this group are going to this other group. The jobs that used to go to the Christians are now going to the Muslims because the new governor is Muslim, and he's giving it to his big family, his keluarga besar. So I think that when you're thinking about multiculturalism, you need to think really about the way you distribute resources through your communities, because the misdistribution of resources is the thing that leads to the sorts of resentments and the sorts of stroppiness that give you conflict.
But you do get, as you mentioned, these occasional serious explosions of violence, and the Chinese have really suffered terribly from virtual pogroms at different times. So how is that actually contained and put back together?
Can I just say that I think that, not dissimilar to Australia, most of those pogroms are actually reflections on a large screen of small conflicts that are going on in politics. We're really, it's local politicians and national politicians who are trying to curry favor and therefore and use the prospect of conflict as a way of doing that. I think that the Chinese have suffered disproportionately because they are disproportionately wealthy, it's true, but they're integrated into Indonesian society in a way that is much more has become much more dramatic in recent years. The likelihood of another pogrom, I think, is diminished as Indonesia has strengthened its democracy and as they have been able to reduce the need to have an outside enemy to bring the country together. And the Chinese was always, lighting a match under the tinderbox of anti-Chinese sentiment was always a touchstone thing for a government to do when it was feeling threatened in its own power. And as we've consolidated democracy, I think that will become less likely.
Paul, I'll just bring you in on this question of multiculturalism. The questioner asks, essentially, is it a good or a bad thing?
Well, this is a fantastic project that Australia's been involved in. I mean, the extent to which we've brought people to this country from all corners of the earth has been a phenomenal achievement. There will always be tensions in multiculturalism. That's inevitable. I think our record, our achievements as a multicultural society are very impressive. I'm confident about the future, but leadership is required. Not just leadership from the Australian government, which is very important, but leadership from all communities. I mean, I think the way to understand this whole debate about multiculturalism is that it's based on shared respect and shared responsibility. There is no point just talking about rights, you've got to talk about responsibilities as well across the board. And by and large, we've done that well. We've got to continue to do it well.
You're watching Q&A. It's live from the Melbourne Writers' Festival. Our next question comes from Ilana Fafaro.
In response to the mass atrocities committed by the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq, President Barack Obama has spoken of the need to prevent a potential act of genocide against the Yazidi people. Yet America, Australia and other nations are reluctant to engage militarily. What action is needed to protect the lives of innocent civilians and minority groups from the Islamic State militia?
Gareth Evans.
Well, I think Obama reacted in exactly the right way, and he was supported in exactly the right way by the relevant Western governments. When it became clear that we were facing a massacre situation, the Yazidis were facing a massacre situation, the response was quick and swift, not just humanitarian aid, but military aid properly directed to averting that immediate crisis. I fear there are going to be many more such instances which are going to require the exercise of that kind of judgment. You've got to be very careful about throwing a military solution at any of these problems. It can be very counterproductive. If you're doing stuff from the air, there's always the risk of civilian casualties. There's always the risk of inflaming sentiment against you, even though your motivations are absolutely pure. If you try and put boots on the ground, you multiply the problems of characterisation of the situation as Islam versus the West and so on, and there's no guarantee that you'll be any more successful than the Americans or the coalition was in putting 150,000 pairs of boots on the ground in Iraq without achieving stability. So it's a very, very difficult judgment to make about what is the right response. But we've had too many Srebrenicas standing by while 8,000 men and boys were taken out and shot. We've had too many Rwandas standing by while 800,000 people were executed within a few short weeks. We have, as an international community, moved quite remarkably, I think, over the last 10 years, and Australia's been one of the leading countries, we've been players in this, to get recognition of this concept of the responsibility to protect vulnerable at-risk populations against genocide and other major crimes.
Gareth, will that principle ever work if it's applied selectively, as it appears to be?
Well, there's inevitably an issue of judgment involved about which particular solution is best crafted to the particular case. I mean, in the case of Kenya, in 2008, it wasn't a military response. It was a diplomatic response, very effectively led by Kofi Annan. Often naming and shaming and political pressure and threats of criminal court prosecution and so on will be effective. When you're talking about a military response, the options are very narrow indeed, and there are some situations which are never going to be possible. If there were to be a situation of the Russians, for example, committing atrocity crimes against the southern Chechen regions, if the Chinese were to go crazy in Xinjiang, if Indonesia were to have gone crazy as it was doing in Indonesia, you can't, in East Timor back in 98, 99, you can't in those situations simply send in military resources without inflaming a full-scale war. It's got to be with the consent of the country in question. So there's always an element of inbuilt double standard. But you sure as hell don't adopt the principle that we can't intervene militarily anywhere if we can't do it everywhere. It is a matter of case-by-case judgment against carefully devised criteria which are out there in the international domain at the moment. We don't always get it right, but I think we got it right with the Yazidis, and we may have to get it right again, and fast, in Iraq, Syria at the moment with the situation with the IS. Right now, we've just got reports over the last 24 hours of another Shiite village, 20,000 people at risk of massacre from these marauding characters. This really may require nothing less than another full-scale military protective operation.
So you presumably, very briefly, you'd support an Australian decision to engage with the Americans in the airstrikes?
Provided it is in this humanitarian context, and that's the language that Tony Abbott, the Prime Minister, has in fact used in recent days. It's a much, much more difficult call to talk about using military force through the Americans or anyone else just to prop up the present Iraqi government or try and maintain the state of Iraq as it is at the moment. Even with the recent change of leadership of Iraq, which is a consummation devoutly to be wished, given the terrible divisiveness of Maliki we proceeded in. But there's so many issues of distinguishing between good guys and bad guys in that region, knowing who and what it is that you're seeking to shore up and protect, that we should be extremely, extremely cautious about any kind of general political intervention, as distinct from a very sharply targeted humanitarian protection intervention.
Okay, brief answers, because we've got a few questions to go to.
I just think, I totally agree, people who are about to be exterminated should be protected, absolutely. But I think we need to be conscious of the regional and global tensions there as well, between Iran and Saudi Arabia, America and Russia, and so on and so forth. These are the things that are inflaming it, as well as economic and political inequalities. As long as they're there, sending in all the troops, and it's happened a number of times before. You know, this is not the first Sunni insurrection in Iraq. It happened, the surge put it down, but it inflamed again. So as long as the root economic and political causes aren't addressed, I don't think all the armies in the world can bring peace.
Okay, we've got quite a few questions to get through. We've got different topics as well. We've got a question tonight from Brian Parker.
Thank you, Tony. While in opposition, Gough Whitlam was able to articulate his vision on reforms and policies. Is it acceptable in these political times that parties in opposition do not articulate what they stand for or their visions and do not offer an alternative solution to our country's voters?
Paul Kelly.
Well, it's a good question, and I think really what we're talking about here is a problem with the political system, both government and opposition. In the recent book I've done looking at the former Labor government, the Rudd-Gillard government, I carefully assessed what they'd done. I make a number of quite strong criticisms of both Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard, but in the process of doing this, having covered Australian politics for 40 years, the conclusion I came to was there's another problem, and that is there's a problem of the system. And I think our political system is being transformed. And there are very significant underlying problems now arising from technology, communications, culture, and they tend to intersect. Now, just take some examples. Everything is speeded up. Everything is much faster now. It's very hard for governments to deliver considered responses based on consultation and compromise. The media forces a declaration immediately. Then you've got the power of the negative campaign, enormously important in the Rudd-Gillard period. The power of sectional interest groups. It's quite difficult to put forward the case for the national interest. Often there's not much of a constituency for the national interest, there's just a whole series of sectional interests. So what I've argued in the book is that it wasn't just a problem of Rudd and Gillard, although I'm very critical of them, but there's another problem, and it's a problem of the system, and that goes to your question. It's not just that it's difficult for oppositions to make a case, it's particularly difficult, I think, for an opposition to mount a case for reform. You cannot market a tough policy from opposition, but it's also particularly difficult for governments.
Gareth Evans.
Well, one of the reasons you can't market a difficult policy from opposition is the media doesn't make it easier to talk in anything other than slogans. And I have to say, Paul, I mean, you've adopted a stance of rather pontifical aloofness on this particular issue in the book that you've just, a brilliant book that you've just written. And I really do think you have to acknowledge that the media is at least part of the problem because of the way they've insisted on an almost caricature dimension to the political context.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, of course
you are pontifically aloof.
Of course the media... Of course the media is part of the problem, however, I'd say this.
But I do want to say some more.
Yeah, you've got to be very careful.
I just couldn't resist the shaft. But
you've got to be very careful about sheeting home responsibility to the media when, in fact, you've got a bad government.
Yep.
You've got a bad government involved in a fairly dysfunctional policy process. Okay, the media can accentuate the trend, but the media is not the source of the fundamental
I'm just going to interrupt
problem.
you because we've got a question on this and we'll come back to this discussion.
But I think
the question is right on this subject, Gareth, so let's go to Liam Arad.
Do you believe that with the effects of the 24-hour media cycle, the long-term objectives within the government are becoming unsustainable?
Gareth, and then we'll hear from others.
Well, the 24/7 media cycle is partly an explanation of how difficult it is to articulate and achieve long-term objectives, but it's also a bit of an excuse. I do agree with Paul that an awful lot depends on the willingness of governments and oppositions to address the hard issues. I do think it's important, answering the previous question, to articulate a philosophy of what it is you're about and to stick to that in a coherent way. I mean, my book, that's just been published, or about to be published this week, does identify how successfully I think the Hawke-Keating government did that. We had right from the outset a basic model of governance identified, which had these basic third way elements of bone-dry economics, rather moist social policy with the concept of the social wage enabling us to square the circle between those two, and then as a third dimension, a liberal internationalist foreign policy. And that really governed, as Paul knows better than most because he's written brilliantly about it, that really governed the way in which we went about our business, the way in which we explained to the community what it is we were trying to do, was the context within which we put everything. If you're just darting around from one big thought bubble to the next and one good big idea to the next and not putting it in a coherent framework, then I think it is very difficult to get traction in terms of improving the quality of the debate. You do have to feed the media beast, we all understand that, but I think Gareth, we'd win a lot more respect in the bcommunity if we stood back a bit.
Gareth, what about the political side of the equation of feeding the media beast, and that is to go out, focus group poll for ideas, and in fact, if Wayne Swan is correct, Kevin Rudd focus polled for his core belief. Is this one of the problems, that there is a political class now called focus group polling, sit within the organisation and tell politicians what they should believe?
All I can say from my own experience in the Hawke-Keating government, when we had a problem with the focus groups, that was the beginning of the argument, not the end of it. That's when we went out and said, we've got to demonstrate a bit of leadership, we've got to explain what the hell it is we're trying to do, we've got to put it in a broader context. Admittedly, that was a lot easier to do when Paul Keating could just get up in the press gallery, persuade half a dozen of the senior scribes, Paul Kelly preeminent among them, and if you could get that sort of consensus at that kind of level, your task of persuading the community was much easier than it is now. But I still think that's the way we ought to approach this, and to be, you know, wet finger in the air driven, and to think that you're going to win credibility with the population is to buy yourself the kind of environment we now have in the Senate, where the small parties take over with the... I mean, we had some wackos in my time in the Senate that remind me about Mabo, West Australian Greens and so on, but now the inmates really have taken over the asylum. And I think we're part of the problem. The governments and oppositions have contributed to that environment, and we've got to break out of it somehow.
I'm a citizen of both the UK and the US, so I have the dubious pleasure of voting in two countries. I know a bit about dysfunctional government in both of those, and I know a bit about politics, which is he said, she said driven. And even I, looking at what was happening in the Labour Party recently, think, wow, it's really two bald men, two bald people fighting over a comb. I mean, it was really extraordinary from the outside trying to understand what that little spat was all about. It's true, I think, that the 24-hour news cycle really it encourages that. And I was once a hack who worked on a news wire, and so we were in the days when there was much less, there were no social media, there was no rolling TV, we had much more of a 24-hour news cycle pressure than anything else, and you do find yourself doing that he said, she said, he said, she said thing, just to keep the cycle going. So I agree with that. But I would say that it's really easy to diss focus group politics and, you know, government by focus group, but isn't that really what democracy is?
It depends who's in the focus groups, I suppose. Paul, what do you think? Is that what democracy is?
Well, I think the art of leadership is persuasion. You see, the great problem with Kevin Rudd as Prime Minister was Kevin Rudd was obsessed about polling, obsessed about focus groups, crazy about media controls, wanted to control everything. There was one problem. He couldn't persuade. He couldn't persuade the Australian public, whether it was on climate change or the mining tax or many other policies. And so this, in fact, this is what Paul Keating was extremely good at. He could actually shift public opinion. And that is really the art. That's really the art of being a great statesman. I mean, you don't just read what the polls say and regurgitate to the people what they think. You actually are alert and aware to what public opinion says, but given that information, you then go out and try and move the country towards better national interest policies.
Paul, you also write about special interest groups and their role in this whole process, and I think you just left that out of that equation, because when you talked about the mining tax, wasn't it significant that the mining industry mounted a national advertising campaign?
It was, Tony. It was very significant, and that was a classic example of the power of a sectional interest group. However, I've got, I'm sorry to mention my book again, but I've got a long chapter on the mining tax, and I've looked at this issue in great detail. And what I argue is that the Rudd government broke every rule in the book about taxation reform. Every single rule. They had a flawed model. They didn't go and consult, they didn't compromise, and they deliberately decided to take the industry by ambush. So they thought that was clever politics, and they got that wrong. Okay. And essentially what they did was they thought that by focusing on the mining industry, bringing down this mining tax without consultation, that they would be able to leverage the idea of fairness and have a significant political victory. It backfired enormously. It's a classic case. It's a classic case of defective approach to policy that I'm talking about now.
Gareth wants to jump in, but do it briefly.
Well, one of the reasons the Hawke Keating government was regarded as a gold standard government, that's my story and I'm sticking to it, but is that we did things like the petroleum resource rent tax completely differently through a consultative process, and that was a big reform on the scale of the mining tax, and the contrast is pretty spectacular.
Look, this is a fantastic example. The Hawke government had a model. They had a model, they consulted, they introduced the model. Now, all the Rudd government had to do was follow that model. It was there, it was established by the Labor government of the 1980s, and they didn't. They tried to be much smarter and they got caught out.
Okay, and very briefly, the Abbott government, because is it falling into the same traps in your view? They obviously couldn't put forward a series of major reforms because they were running a kind of oppositional policy without a reform agenda when they came to government. Now you have to wait effectively till next term to do big reforms that you think are necessary.
Well, in terms of the argument I'm putting forward, it seems to me that the problems that afflict the Abbott government at the moment fit perfectly. And just think about this. When Tony Abbott was opposition leader, he was enormously effective. As Prime Minister, he's not been nearly as effective, and there's a problem with the message. There's a problem in persuading people. If we look at the Labor Party in opposition looks formidable, running a negative campaign, a very negative campaign, and they've done very well. How did Labor go in government when they had to try and carry the country on positive policies? Badly. So I think, unfortunately, one of the takeouts here is that governing is more difficult today, reforming is more difficult still, but the problem here is we need reform. We do have a budget problem in this country. We have a serious budget problem, and a mature and rational society will start to tackle that problem now. If we don't, then it will be a far more painful task further down the track.
Ali, do you want to come in on this?
Yeah, sure. I'm just amazed that you guys write in turning this stuff into books that are publishable and readable. I mean, I'm sorry, I'm a fiction writer and a poet, and I think you should be teaching creative writing, because to make this stuff creative and readable is amazing. Because it's very dramatic. I mean, Shakespeare had interesting monarchs. They killed each other in very colourful, interesting ways. But
what do you think happened to Kevin Rudd?
Well,
metaphorically speaking.
Metaphorically, you see, you need no.
Well, we've moved on from Shakespeare's times. They don't actually kill our leaders now, necessarily. Before we go tonight, let's move to another completely different topic. Next question comes from Elaine O'Shannessy.
I enjoy my life currently, but I do not want to end up trapped in a nursing home, as my lovely mother was a few years ago, when I can no longer feed or dress myself or go to the toilet unaided. I refuse to be a burden to society, my family, and whatever friends are left alive by then. I want to be remembered as lively and active, not as bedridden and helpless. But neither do I want to bring the law down upon someone who takes pity on me and helps me to die sooner rather than later. So why do we, as conscious and rational individuals, still not have the right to choose how and when we die?
Tasneem, what do you think about this? It's rare, isn't it, that religion doesn't have some say in these issues?
And I should point out, I'm not the spokesperson for Islam on the panel, although it might look like it. Look, it's clearly a topic that is saturated in emotion, and I can feel it. I can feel it in the way that you've told me, Elaine. I mean, having said that, there is a religious standpoint on this issue from my tradition, which is that life is sacred and therefore the taking of life is not permissible unless it's by God. That's the simplistic black and white part of it. That doesn't take away from my compassion and my feeling for what you're going through or what you would be going through. And having said that, there will be a lot of divergent views even within the Muslim experience of people who might decide to follow that path and those that totally uphold what is, I guess, the religious sanction. So it's still again, it's like with all faith traditions, there'll be the black and white, but there'll be the grey area too in terms of what you actually then practice. So,
do you think people should have the choice, though?
I think, yeah, look, I don't think it's not a black and white issue. I understand that people should have a choice if they're guided by their faith or they're guided by law, though that's up to them.
Elizabeth.
When I first came to Australia, it was about 15 years ago, and I was doing a bit of work for the Victorian Health Promotion Association, Vic Health. And I was quite shocked because the image of Australia overseas is, you know, swashbuckling, anything goes, we're so relaxed and whatever. And I get here.
We're so
and
old.
I'm locked inside the biggest nanny state on the planet, you know. Everyone waits at red lights. There's no car for, 6 miles in either direction, but everyone waits to cross the road. And I'm told that it's good if I cycle to work, but I have to wear a helmet if I do, and et cetera, et cetera. And we have this presentation at Vic Health, and it's about how well Australia is doing in all of this health promotion stuff. And this guy says, here are the leading causes of death and disability right now for women in Australia, and number 1 is smoking-related diseases, number 2 is traffic accidents, number 3 is sexually transmitted infections, number 4 is ischemic heart disease. But we're doing really well in all of our health promotion campaigns, so here's what we're projecting for 2020. Number 1 is dementia, number 2 is depression, number 3 is ischemic heart disease, whatever. And I'm like, wow. Okay, so I should cycle to work, but I must wear a helmet. I can't smoke even outside at the MCG, go figure. I can drink light beer. I can't have sex without a condom ever. All of these things. I can't drive over certain... All so that I can live long enough to be demented. I mean, number 2, depression, that's given. That's going to be a given with all of that. So I think that if Australia is essentially patting itself on the back about creating a demented, depressed society, you better think about eugenics. I mean euthanasia.
Just by the way, because you said you vote in both the US and Britain, which of those countries allows you to run a red light with impunity?
Oh, we do all kinds of things with impunity in both of those countries.
Ali?
Well, I mean, I'm personally probably on the side of that, but I just feel like this is really, it's an experiential decision to make. It's easy for us who haven't had the experience of looking after a dying person or about to die to really know precisely how it feels. But it should be experiential and subjective, and I think that it's one of the reforms that this country will have to make sooner or later, but perhaps back to the question of politicians having the courage or ability to make reforms, we might all be dead before it happens.
But do you care?
Or demented.
Right, Gareth.
Well, I think anyone who wasn't moved by that question has not been listening. I mean, it's a very, very serious issue. I find it a serious issue. I'm moving into my 8th decade next week, and I'm moving into dementia territory in a big way, I fear, as a result of this. But I would certainly want to have that choice, that rational choice, and I think that's the opinion of a vast majority of people in this country, and I hope that view prevails, and I hope the political class is courageous enough to recognise and make it possible.
Gareth, that question did have your name on the front of it, and I, out of deference, chopped it off, but it sounds like that was a bad idea.
Yeah.
So choice should be...
Sorry,
you were Attorney General, though. Why didn't you make it happen then?
Well, that's a good question. I tried to make a lot of things happen in federal civil liberties law and constitutional law and all sorts of other things. There wasn't really a market for it back in those days. There was a market for it in opposition, but not in government. But look, it's, culture changes, times change. I think, gay marriage, one would have thought inconceivable to even contemplate back then. Now it's a given, hopefully. And I think this is the next big thing to get right, particularly with an ageing society. We are all going to confront these dilemmas in our personal life and our family life, and I don't think the law should stand in the way of rational, civilised choices by people who want to make those choices.
Elizabeth, I cut you off there, sorry.
I think Gareth has answered my point. My question was just going to be, if you're correct that the majority of Australians want this and you have a democracy, why don't you have it? And I think you've addressed that.
Paul.
Well, I respect very much the proposition you put, a very moving proposition, and I wouldn't want any of my comments to be interpreted as disrespecting you. This is, however, not just a decision about individuals, It's a decision about what sort of society we are going to be. And we are really talking here about the terms and conditions under which we would have a regime in which people can be killed. People would give their consent and that would happen. And we should be frank about what we're talking about here. This will change the culture of the medical profession. It will change family relationships. If this is the law, if there is an option there, if there's a choice, it will lead to a whole series of pressures. Now, we've had debates about this in the past, and the interesting thing about the debates is there has been strong support for euthanasia, but the arguments against euthanasia also have been very, very strong. I think that we'll see this debate continue, given that we have an ageing population. Obviously, this is going to be a very, very important debate, but it is a much more complex debate than many people recognise.
Well, I'm just going to go back to our question because she was shaking her head rather vigorously there. Do you want to respond to that?
It is an issue for an individual. That's exactly what it is. And if I wanted to choose to end my life when I was good and ready, then it's got nothing to do with anybody else. I don't think we have to have rules and laws and all the rest of it that you just mentioned. I think it's a very individual, personal thing.
We are nearly out of time, Paul. Do you want to quickly respond to that?
No, I won't. I mean, I respect your view, but I don't agree with you. And I'd say that it cannot be just seen as an individual decision. This is a decision about society. It's about what sort of society we are going to be. I don't think we can walk away from that.
I'm sorry to say to those with their hands up, that is all we have time for. We're running out of programme time. Please thank our panel, Paul Kelly, Tasneem Chopra, Elizabeth Pisani, Gareth Evans and Alizadeh. Thank you, and a special thanks to our Melbourne Writers' Festival and to this wonderful audience. You can give yourselves a quick round of applause if you wouldn't mind. OK, next Monday we have another big event for Q&A when we join the Festival of Dangerous Ideas at the Sydney Opera House. On the panel there'll be 6 dangerous women thinkers, courageous journalist Lydia Katcher, who risks her life to report on violence and sexual slavery in Mexico. American writer Kay Heimowitz, who fears feminism is turning men into children. Joint-destroying Australian feminist Jane Caro. Swedish anarcho-feminist writer Kajsa Ekman, I should say, who argues surrogacy is child trafficking, and Nadja Tolyakonikova and Masha Yonikina, 2 of the founding members of Pussy Riot, the Russian punk band whose guerrilla performance highlighted Vladimir Putin's repressive regime. And just before we go tonight, a correction. Last week on Q&A, I said that the Prime Minister's chief business advisor, Maurice Newman, claims the world is actually cooling. Well, this was based on his recent public statements, drawing attention to claims the planet is cooling rather than warming. Mr. Newman has contacted the ABC to point out he does not claim the Earth is cooling, but only that a cooling planet is a possibility that scientists and policymakers should consider more seriously. No, seriously, we're very happy to have Maurice Newman come and take your questions on that subject, and we're happy to clarify that point. Till next Monday's Q&A, good night.